I'm Daisy.
And I'm Terry.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 121.
And this week it's Daisy's turn to share something with us. Daisy, what do you have?
Well, Terry, I have something new for you. We were having a discussion the other day where we were both saying that we were suffering a little bit from podcast fatigue. It was bound to happen sooner or later. And that both of us have more just been sort of listening to fiction audiobooks. And we were joking that maybe we would have to do some episodes sharing our favourite Netflix and trashy Audible thriller selections. But we sort of are more in the position of having to go look for something often. So I thought, well, yes, I'm going to go look for something. This was a couple of days ago, and maybe I'll go looking for some new podcasts. So I went looking for some new podcasts and came up with a couple. My first one I came across was it's called Slow Mo with Mo Gaudat. I don't know if you know, or Godat. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He's an interesting guy. I think I've listened to him on probably Rangan Chatterjee's podcast, something like that. And he came up in suggested podcasts, and there were all sorts of interesting ones. There was an episode that was entitled something like Be Your Own Therapist. So I thought this will be great. And it wasn't too long. But no, it was one of those where we've had this discussion where it's a very interesting podcast to listen to and a very interesting discussion they're having, but really nothing that I could turn into a structure to share with you. So I went through a couple of those and decided that just wasn't going to work out. So I went on to my next selection, which was Marie Forleo podcast. And I was trying to remember who shared her stuff before. And I can't remember whether it was you or whether it was me or whether we both have. But we both quite liked the things she has to say. So I thought, well, I'll give her a go. And there was a series she was doing on her podcast called Take a Breath, which is all about breathing and meditation. And I thought, well, this is something that I keep saying I'm interested in and I'd like to get a bit more involved in. So let's dig into these. First couple of episodes I listened to, no, they're a bust. They're not going to work. But the third one, I struck lucky. And that's what I'm coming to you with today. Marie Forleo, for people who don't know, is an American entrepreneur. She is also a philanthropist, a New York Times best-selling author. And her two books, I didn't know about the second one, which sort of brings a little bit of vomit up. But the one that we've discussed before, which we both found interesting, is Everything is Figure-Outable. But the other one is entitled Make Every Man Want You. And I will tell you with complete certainty that I'm not going to read that one.
Oh, jeez.
But she also has Marie TV, very popular channel on YouTube, and a training school called B School. So this podcast episode is number 319 from her podcast. And as I mentioned, it's part of this Take a Breath series, part 4. And it is with Transform Your Mind with Meditation teachers Preethaji and Krishnaji. And this particular episode in the Take a Breath series is about being in the present and gaining awareness of which one of two states we are in. And they're quite black and white. Well, not quite. They're very black and white about these two states. Apparently, we are always in one of two states, which I will go on to tell you about very, very shortly. And it's maybe not something that everyone will agree with, but I found it quite interesting. They start off with a story of two monks, Yesmi and Nomi, who are returning to their monastery and they have to cross a river. They hear a woman crying as they are about to cross, and Yasmi asks her what is wrong. And she says that she needs to cross the river, but the river is pretty high. And she is fearful about not getting back to her toddler, who is on the other side and crying. Yasmi offers to help and carries her across and leaves her on the opposite bank. The two monks continue on their journey back to the monastery. Half an hour later, Nomi is very agitated and confronts Yasmi about this incident of helping the woman across the river and asks why he did it when they are taught not to look at, talk to, or touch women. Why have you done this? He asks, when it is very wrong. We've been taught it's very wrong. And Yasmi replies very calmly, yes, but I dropped her half an hour ago on the bank of the river, but you are still carrying her. And so this episode is all about how much we carry our worries about the past or anxiety about the future in our minds. And a lot of us are not present enough in the moment. And then they go on to talk about these two states that we are always in. Apparently, we are always in one or the other. And those two states are the suffering state and the beautiful state. And when we are in the beautiful state, we are in the present. We have no inner conflict. It is not an emotional high, but it is more of a feeling of being connected to life and other people. Whereas the suffering state takes us away from the beautiful state. It is any state in which you are experiencing an inner disturbance. And they go on to give a few examples, like, if you're relating to your child in a beautiful state, you can relate to your child with love. In a suffering state, it's more confusion and conflict. Relating to work, you're connected to the work you are doing and the vision you have, or you're in a state of conflict, of not knowing what you're going to do with your life, constantly in a state of worry. And the most important question, they say, is what state do I want to live my life from? And they maintain that we don't give sufficient attention to what our current state is, the state that we are in right now, and that life too often revolves around external stuff, things that we can gain, things that we can achieve. Even with this, they say that if you can come from a beautiful state, it will be more nurturing to yourself and others. But how? Marie asks, how, when all this shit is going on in my life, how do I go about this? They say that you need to start with awareness. That I feel like this is a bit of a buzzword in our podcast. We keep coming back to the first step. The first thing you have to do is be aware of what's going on. But it is so true, isn't it? And bring attention to the emotions you are feeling and identify which state you're in, which can be easier said than done. And they talk about how when you're in suffering, you're constantly obsessed about yourself. It's all turned inwards. And they give an example of getting fired from your job. So you get fired. And the problem, obviously, is you need to find another job. But you're suffering because you get tied up in obsessive thoughts about yourself. How would I pay my mortgage? How would I feed my kids? How would I tell my family? What are people going to think about me? And you've moved away from the problem and turned in to yourself when that happens. And when that happens, you are in suffering. And you need to pay attention to the thought process to free yourself from the suffering state and start to connect to the problem. And they say that the more you suffer, the more the brain shrinks in size, where the more you feel connected, the more the brain expands. It reminds me very much of our last episode when you talk about surrender. And they mentioned, and I know you've mentioned this way back when in another episode, that we have over 10,000 thoughts a day. 83% of those are repetitive and 80% are negative. And we do tend to have this negativity bias, which again, I think you might have mentioned last week. It's, from an evolutionary perspective, there's a reason for that, but often not very helpful. So how do we move from this suffering state to the beautiful state? We bring awareness to thought, to the thought processes. And immediately when we start this awareness process, they maintain that we automatically start moving to the beautiful state as opposed to the suffering state. Once you see the truth of these self-obsessed thoughts, once you can clearly see the problem, you can get back your vision, bring intelligence, strength and courage and connection back into the equation and go back to solving the problem and get closer to finding a solution. The suffering state, they sort of sum up, is an engrossment with yourself, an engagement just with yourself, and you're more likely to have a negative impact on others. And the beautiful state is a place of connection. And they go on to take you through a guided practice, which I did. I suggest, if you're interested in this, you go and do. It's like 3 minutes or something. And it is very much, it's just a sort of mindful being aware of the thoughts you're having in your head and identifying which state they're coming from. And it doesn't actually push you to resolve anything. It very much felt like a sort of a teaser, made me want to go and find out a bit more. So I'm quite keen to find out a bit more and maybe read their book, which is called The 4 Sacred Secrets for Love and Prosperity, a guide to living in a beautiful state. So there you have it. It did remind me quite a lot of your concept that you were talking about last time about surrendering, and when you were talking about in surrendering the grieving process and the hard work and the commitment. And it just reminded me of that, what they're saying about moving from one state to another, that sort of closed off, looking inward, self-obsessed type thoughts, and moving from that to a more expansive, looking outwards, connection, surrendering, engaging with the problem and working towards a solution.
I think that sounds so important. I'm guessing it's one of those things that would take some mindset shift or something for me to really wrap my mind around. But I think for so many of us, getting out of that suffering state, because, when something bad is going on in our lives, feeling so encompassed in the problem, and how to shift out of that so that you can get into that beautiful state. It's one of those things, as I listen to you say, it's like, oh, that sounds so good. Like, yes, I want to go from here to here, but
easier said than done.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what made me, it felt like, that's kind of what I meant, where it sort of felt like a bit of a teaser. It felt like, I feel like I need more of these guided practices or something. I need to learn a little bit more. Tell me how a bit more I go from one state to another. And of course, it was a relatively short podcast. So they're summing up very quickly saying, well, you need to be aware of these processes and these thought processes, and that automatically sort of takes you out. But I definitely felt, that certainly sounds easier said than done. But I thought it was an interesting concept, and I could see where they were coming from. I could feel that very sort of that inward self-obsessed spiral. I mean, when you come up with terms like that, self-obsessed, it sounds, and when you were talking about surrendering there, we kind of have some negative connotations with things like that. And the more I listen to them, and they're, as you can imagine, they're quite gentle with what they're saying. It feels like quite a harsh term, self-obsessed. Oh, you're self-obsessed. Ooh. But I didn't get the sense that they felt like that. It just felt like this sort of inward spiraling when you can't just stop thinking about the impact it's having on you, and woe is me and all these bad things, and it does close you off and take you so far away from the problem that you need to solve. And it's finding a way to break out of that.
And I think part of that less self-focused piece is when I can get out of that place of just seeing everything closing in on me, I can start to see what are the things outside of me? What are the resources? What are the tools? Who are the people?
Yeah, I mean, the big word was connection.
Uh-huh.
And I got the impression that beautiful state felt very much like you describing surrender. It didn't say, oh, beautiful state sounds all light and fluffy and nice. That's just where I want to be. I didn't get the sense it felt like it had much more weight behind it than that. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily going to feel all light and fluffy. It's something that, could take some work and be quite difficult. It's not necessarily a, happy sunshine thing, mm-hmm. as opposed to a doom and gloom suffering state. It's a lot more complex than that, I think.
But again, it's that shifting into a more expansive place in the mind rather than the closed in, burdened place. And I think for all of us, that's something to continue to create and find these strategies that help us to tap into that, because it is so easy to get so overwhelmed by what feels like just kind of caving in on you and weighing you down, versus if you can just see just outside of those boundaries, what's out here? Besides me in this moment with this problem, what else is around me?
Yeah. And it felt a little bit like like I said, I did do their guided practice, and it felt a little bit like they were holding that space. We talked about that space before a couple of episodes back. It felt a little bit like they were just creating that by saying, hold on a minute, just look at your thought. What thoughts are you having? Let's identify, let's be aware of these. Where are they coming from? Is this a suffering state or a beautiful state? And they don't offer any solutions or anything like that. It's just a mindful, in the present, guided practice to identify what's going on. So yeah, interesting.
You can imagine as you think about that, like, one, I need them following me around all day to do this checking in. And then I will probably feel like throttling them at some point, like, I don't know where it's coming from. Tell me what to do. But again, I think so many of these things are really just helping ourselves learn ways of kind of shifting our energy, our focus. Because when we look at things or we experience it from this angle, we're going to be stuck in this suffering state. And when we can shift over to here, we can address it so much differently.
Yeah, and it's just coming at a similar thing from different directions and finding who you gel with. They're like, I'm quite interested. Okay, so what's the next guided practice? What do I do next? Now I've identified the thoughts I'm having in this moment. Now what do I do?
Well, beware.
So a little sort of teaser for you.
Yeah, beware, Daisy, because now I'm going to go listen to it. And I'm going to practice their script. And the next time you come to me and tell me there's a crisis going on, I'm going to be them and walk through the steps with you.
There you go. I shall look forward to that.
Very good.
In the meantime, happy searching for your next podcast episode. Maybe go looking for a new podcast. In the meantime, have a very wonderful week.
You too, Daisy. Take good care, everybody. Bye.